Before you can build anything, you need to know what you're allowed to build and what actually makes sense to build. That's where the schematic design comes in. This is where you begin to illustrate your vision for the project. In this step of the feasibility study, we take everything we learned from the site analysis and the market study, the zoning, the setbacks, topography, demand, competition, and we translate it into a building concept that works for the lot and the market. In this video, we're going to walk you through a real-life project we're working on right now and show you how we started shaping the actual building, what design decisions we had to make, and why. If you're new here, welcome. I'm Ben, a real estate developer with 30 years of experience. I started flipping houses in 1998 and learned every trade that I could. And eventually, I transitioned into ground-up development. These days, I'm building mid-rise projects. And at the time of this video's release, we're developing a 70-unit building. This video is part 3 in a 5-part series on how to run a full feasibility study. So, if you want the full blueprint, make sure to check out the rest of the series. All the videos are linked in the description below. Now, let's jump into step 3, the schematic design. This is the schematic design step that we use to determine what goes into the pro forma, right? Now, to get to the schematic design, we take the information that we get from the site analysis, which is the zoning, flood maps, topography, historic information, right? And all the things that are going on outside of the lot, right? So we get as much information as possible having to do with the lot itself, right? Then we do a market study. And with the market study, we try to determine what type of unit or what type of real estate is needed in the area based on what's happening now and what's happening in the pipeline, what's going to happen in 5 years from now or 3 years from now when this project is finished. So based on all that information, then we come up with this schematic design. We design the building based on what we find, right? So why don't you take us through this particular site? Just some quick points. This is an actual project that we're working on. And we took out the address because it's confidential, but this is a real deal. This is something that we're doing right now, and we're in the middle of it. And so just take us through it.
The site itself actually consists of several different lots, right? So although it's not depicted here, what is shown is the entirety of all those lots. So in this particular case, it's about 20,000 aggregate square feet of land, some of which is vacant, some of which has existing buildings that would have to be demolished. And this site, this is the perimeter that I'm identifying here. That 20,000 square feet is surrounded by other 2-story, 3-story, 4-story, primarily all residential buildings. So directly adjacent to the site, there is I think about a 2 or 3-story building on one side, the eastern side of the lot. And then on the northern side, there's also a building that is on the property line. That is a residential building that I believe is 3 or 4 stories. And then behind these lots, the backyard of our building, there are the backyards of these other buildings, all of which are primarily residential. So that's important because we have to factor in what our neighbors look like. Are they built on the lot line? Are they set back from the lot line? Depending on what the zoning says as well, it can impact our building and what we can do. And can we build on the lot line? Is there anything specific to our neighbors that would prevent us from doing that? So in this particular case, we had neighbors that were built on the lot line. So they have a building that is on the lot line, and some of which have side yard windows. So they have windows on the lot line facing our lot. So, this is something that we run into commonly in older neighborhoods back when zoning perhaps didn't exist or wasn't really enforced. People just did things, right? So they may have installed a window. after the building was built, perhaps, or maybe it was done from the start, originally a 100-year-old building. Unfortunately for us, now, because in this case, there is an existing neighboring building with the window, we had to set back our building from that lot line. Of course, we also study the zoning, right, to understand what is it saying about the setbacks, the side yard requirements, front yard setback requirements, rear yard requirements. This lot, the lots that make up the entirety of this 20,000 square feet of land are all zoned basically 1 and 2 family residential. So what we are proposing here is a multifamily building, which isn't allowed as of right. But it's something that, given the size of the land, makes more sense to do.
So just to go back to that point on the windows that are on the adjacent buildings, every city's different, right? Here where we are, they require you to set back away from the windows about 3 feet or so to give light and air to that building, right? But if you go to other cities, that may not be the case, right? In some other cities, the city will allow you to just block up or just block their windows and build right up to the building. Now,
Yeah,
I'm not sure exactly, what cities allow or what they don't allow. But here where we are, they want that setback.
Yeah,
I've heard rumors like in Manhattan, for example, where you could force the neighbor to just close up the windows because they shouldn't have had those windows to begin with, right, facing your building.
Yeah, that would be nice, because it's almost like this is our land and we had to give away 3 feet of it that we could have built on. But unfortunately we can't. So yeah, it can vary. In new construction, when we're putting windows in our building, zoning and building codes tell you what you can and cannot do. Building codes strictly say you have a window, a neighboring structure needs to be at least 3 feet away for fire purposes, right? Because fire could break through the window and spread the fire to a neighboring building. But yeah, there's different factors at play that could affect what you're allowed to do wherever you're doing your project. But here we had to set it back, so we factored that in, and it's a more conservative way. We could probably maybe build part of it against the lot line, on the lot line, setback when we hit the window. Let's say we have different options. But there's some pluses and minuses to the way we did it here. Here we just set back the whole building 3 feet from the side yards. And one of the pluses is when we build this thing, that 3 foot setback comes in handy, right? Like, you need access to the facade, the bricklayer, or the guy doing the siding, whatever the finish is. There will be 3 feet of space to set up a scaffold or whatever you need to actually do the installation. And you won't need access from your neighbor to do stuff. So there's some pluses and minuses. In our building, we could put windows here now if we required it for a particular layout. So yeah, on this site, there were a couple of things that we had to look at. So we didn't do a front yard setback. It made sense to just build on the lot line along the front on the sidewalks. The rear yards, these lots are not as big. The depth of these lots could have been anywhere. I think they were anywhere from, like, say, 95 feet deep to 80 feet at its shortest point. So it's irregular in shape. So that meant the rear yard setbacks varied based on where you were in the building. Because for us, it's efficient to design your buildings with standard dimensions. This building is about 70 feet deep, which is a good arrangement to have a hallway down the middle, have units on each side of the hallway. So, these constraints around setbacks determine what the building envelope is, and what we might be allowed to do and what we think the city would be comfortable allowing us to do.
So the setbacks are based on what we typically see in this zoning.
Here, because we're going for variances, the zoning's pretty strict because it's single family, two family residential. The setbacks, I think, are 30 to 35 feet on the rear yard. Here, we're not doing that. We basically said, hey, we need a building that's 70 feet deep to make this work or be more efficient. In order to do that, that meant your rear yard setbacks might be 20 feet, 25 feet at certain points, maybe over here in the shortest point might be 15 feet. Why would the city allow us to do that? Because perhaps when you look at the neighboring lots, some of these buildings that are behind us, they're not as big. And so they have rear yards that perhaps are bigger. So there's enough distance between our building and neighboring buildings that it feels like you're not building a building envelope that is excessive for the area. There's enough light and air for this building. There's enough light and air for neighboring structures. So it was a nice balance. All right. So that's what we're always kind of trying to do as we design these things. Come up with things that factoring in all the different things that might affect neighbors and then affects our building too, right? So obviously, if you wanted to have a bigger setback in the rear yard, that will make this building smaller. If you make it too small, then it affects the orientation of your units and how you run your hallway. So on this particular layout, this depth of building is an efficient dimension. So that was one of the things that came into play. Other things that we start to think about when we're looking at the building envelope is on this first floor. The first floor is where we tend to keep all of our common area utilities, mechanicals, things like that. So those are things that make the first floor inefficient. They make the first floor different from all the upper floors. In our case, we decided to do apartments on the first floor. Some of our projects, we might incorporate parking on the ground floor. Here, we decided not to do it. This rentable square footage is more valuable than parking, and it's, at least in terms of rent, what you can achieve from it and the impact that it has on your building and the building type.
Now getting back to parking, for example, in this building, we can not do parking because there's transportation, which is it's an 8-minute walk to the area, right? So you can get away with not having parking.
Yeah, there's public transit, there's buses, right? We have a subway nearby. So there are other options for transit. And in this particular area, the city doesn't want cars. They want people to use public transit. It's better. It's a more sustainable way to get around. And so, having parking here would just end up attracting tenants will end up getting a car that might not otherwise have had a car and bring more traffic into the neighborhood. And the market, based on that market study that we do, right, we see that demand from tenants are saying that we don't necessarily need a car to live here. And so if this was in an area like obviously the suburbs, right, this is not the suburbs, but if you're in the suburbs, it's almost a requirement to have parking. Whether zoning dictates you need it or not, the market may basically be telling you, you need to have parking so that your tenants can have cars to be able to do what they need to do to live. But here you don't need it. It's fine. We hear enough feedback from the market and tenants that they don't need cars here. So we felt comfortable at least eliminating that entirely. We also incorporated bike storage. So that's a means of travel, at least in where this building will be located. Right, you can get around with an e-bike
Sure.
pretty quickly. It's almost a motorcycle.
And now with where technology is going, we just watched a video with cars that are autonomous driving. Who's going to need a garage if cars can just pick you up and take you somewhere, right?
That would be nice, all right? In 10 years, exactly. You walk out of your building, you just hop into a car and somebody takes you there.
So maybe the city knows something that we didn't know yet.
Yeah, could you imagine if you had a building with tons of parking and 10, 15 years, didn't need any of it?
Right. Well, then you convert the parking into condos.
Yeah.
Or apartments.
That'd be a nice future.
Yep.
So here we decided not to do any parking. So we have our common area stuff, bikes, lobbies. Depends on your building. You might need transformer rooms, package rooms, storage, utility, sprinkler rooms, trash rooms, compactors. If your building is big enough, you have fire command centers, you have all kinds of stuff that is not rentable, but your building has to have it and is partly expensive to build. And so it just goes into one of the things that we look at, which is the gross square footage of the building.
Now, these things are very important. A lot of guys will do schematics sometimes and leave these areas out, right? And then they'll realize it down the line when they engage the architect to put together the actual site plans that get approved. What does that do to the numbers when they leave something like that out, and then all of a sudden they get to the end and realize that they need to take away a few units on that ground floor?
Yeah, so one of the things that we look at when we do our schematics is when you take the layout of the first floor. This is a 6-story building, so we'll look at the upper floors in a bit, but this is a 6-story building, and we look at what's the overall gross square footage of the building. So that takes into account what I call the net square footage or the rentable square footage. So those are your apartments. Plus, then you got to add up all those other common areas that you have to build, right? So hallways, utility rooms, mechanical rooms, closets, lobbies, stairwells, elevators, bulkheads, all these different things that you can't get income from it, but they're part of your building. They're part of the gross square footage of the building, and you have to build them, right? They require flooring. There are walls. There's electrical in them, mechanical, HVAC, sprinkler systems. Those are things that cost money in your building, but they're not getting you rent. They don't actually increase the revenue of the building.
Yeah, so you can't get to an accurate pro forma unless you figure out these things.
Yeah, because what happens is as your building requires these things, there's a calculation that there's different names for it. I call it a loss factor. So there's a difference that occurs between your gross square footage and your net square footage. So your net square footage is what drives revenue. It drives the value of the building at the end. It affects all those metrics that have to do with revenue, valuation, income, NOI, things like that. Whereas gross square footage affects your costs. So that disparity in the end, if it gets too great, it affects the profit margin of the building. It affects, creates this differential between what it costs to build and what it's worth. So as that loss factor tends to grow, what happens is you end up building a building that doesn't generate enough revenue, so thus doesn't have enough value to offset the costs. The cost of the building is affected by the gross square footage, all this stuff you got to build that doesn't generate value for you.
And you should find out these things before you purchase the lot. You need to know what are all the things that need to be in there. And if you skip over them, purchase the lot, and then all of a sudden the architect tells you, "Oh, we forgot to add the transformer room. We forgot to add this and that." Right now, you're eating away at the revenue that's coming in at the end.
It's complicated because as your building changes, right, height affects it, zoning, density, all these different things affect some of these requirements of what needs to be in your building. All right, so this is a 6-story building. This layout, we know through experience, this is a reasonable layout of what we need to incorporate in terms of those mechanical, those common areas in the building. But as your building gets taller, like when you get into high-rise code and things like that, you have to start incorporating fire command centers, and the building codes dictate how big those have to be. And as they get bigger, as your building gets bigger, those rooms tend to get larger. Some of them have to be like 250 square feet, so they're eating into valuable square footage. The other thing is like elevators, stairwells, egress, they cut through your whole building, right? They go all the way up to the roof. And so they affect the layouts of all the upper floors. So where those things land affect how you can lay out and create efficiency in your building. Your hallways, trying to minimize the hallways. If you don't set it up the right way, your hallway, you may have hallways that are way too long, completely unnecessary. So yeah, they're important things, because if they're not optimized properly, then you end up having a very inefficient building with high loss factors, and that could just completely wipe out the profit in a building. So those are things that you definitely have to consider. Other things that we did in this particular building is we threw in a gym on the ground floor. We didn't put it on upper floors because the upper floors, we wanted to have common layouts. We'll look at that in a sec, but we threw a gym here. We could also, because it's on the ground floor and is facing front yard, we could end up renting this out. Here, we assumed that we would rent it out to a gym operator, and maybe the gym operator give a discounted rate to tenants. We see a lot of buildings in our area through our market analysis where buildings have gyms in them as they reach a certain size. So we decided to put a gym on the ground floor that's about 3,000 square feet, and through our business plan, thinking about renting this out. So that was one thing. And we have a trash chute room. Trash chutes are something that are important because like a stairwell, they cut through the entire building. They go all the way up to the roof. And so they affect all the layouts on the upper floors. This is the way we decided to lay out the first one. We have 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms. And this was just, I don't think there was necessarily a particular reason why we did a particular unit type on the first floor. It was just dictated by the geometry of this building and approximately the unit sizes. So here we end up with 2 bedrooms that are usually in the 950-ish square foot range, 1 bedrooms that are like, say, 750, studios that are around, say, 600 square feet. And that was dictated by the market analysis that we did, right? So we knew that those types of units were of a particular size. And those are all things that end up affecting the pro forma, because if your unit is too big, you can only charge so much for a studio, right? So if you end up being too big, then your rent per square foot drops. It affects the economics. So these are all things that you're constantly trying to optimize as you design the building. Jump to the upper floor. So the upper floors from the 2nd through the 6th floors are all common in layout. It's a mixture of studios, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms. Here there's about 18 units per floor, and everything is a common layout from the 2nd through the 6th floor. We've seen buildings where sometimes you may have a different layout on an upper floor. We didn't do that here because there are some inefficiencies to doing that, right? If let's say you do like 2nd through 5th floor common, your penthouse, you decide to do something different. Maybe you might do that in a condo building where you're in a high value area and you want to make your penthouse special and large units or something. You change the unit mix on the top floor. Here, it didn't make sense to do that. And by having the common layouts, the structural design of this thing is much more efficient, right? So we don't have load transfer, big beams, things like that affect the structural, and then it tends to affect all your mechanicals or your mechanical, electrical, plumbing design. Tends to cost more when you do stuff like that. So it's good to have common layouts, much easier to build. But this layout's very efficient. We just have a center corridor, units in the front on each side of the hallway, 2 exit stairwells, elevator. So this layout is very efficient. And it's very typical of a building that's of this kind of geometry. This is our first step, right, to understand what this building looks like. So we take the information from here and then start to look at some high-level metrics. So I'll jump into this Excel file that kind of gives you an overview of this building. So like I mentioned before, it's 20,000 square foot piece of land. The overall gross square footage ends up about 96,000. The net rentable square foot is 80,000.
So what's the loss factor? How much went into by percentage the common area?
So the loss factor ended up being 17% for the whole building. That's pretty efficient in terms of the relationship between gross and net square footage. So you can see on the first floor, it says 34%. So that means those common areas like the mechanical rooms, utilities, hallways, things like that, if you add up the square footage, all that ended up being about 34% of the gross square feet of the building on that floor. On the upper floors, which have the common layouts, ends up at about 13%. So this is efficient. Like when I start to see a number like this, I can kind of tell that this is heading in the right direction. Mm-hmm. The numbers should work out, based on other factors, but from a cost perspective, hard cost, soft cost, things like that, I can tell that this building it's trending in the right direction. The other thing is obviously, when we are at this phase of the project, which is very preliminary, right? although we keep in mind some of these things around building codes and zoning codes, these numbers are going to change. We know they're going to change because when you get into construction drawings, we're at a feasibility phase right now. We're not factoring every little detail that comes up in a construction drawing. We don't know where the chases are going to be in this building. Our mechanical design, HVAC, things like that will affect these metrics, right? So if you decide to do, if we decide that, hey, we're going to do split systems, we're going to put air conditioning everywhere, we're going to have refrigerant lines running through, we're going to exhaust out all of our kitchen hoods, or whatever those things that we decide to do will ultimately end up affecting these things later. But at this phase of like a feasibility level, these are metrics that we like to see. I feel comfortable when I start to see that when we get to a point where we start to design in construction drawing phase, and some of these metrics change and some of the efficiencies get worse because you start to incorporate, that detail. It's okay because at this preliminary level, this is a good number to start with. High level, at 18 units a floor, 9 units on the first floor. We had a 3,000 square foot gym that perhaps we can rent out. The unit mix, we had about 20 studios, 45 one bedrooms, 34 two bedrooms. Relative to some past projects, this has more 2 bedrooms compared to some other buildings we've seen. So we liked this unit mix. Some other projects that we see are a little bit heavier in studios in our market. 1 bedrooms in terms of number of units, this is pretty reasonable. So this mix was good for us. The average unit sizes for all of them were good. Overall, the building, the way it's set up, and when we start to run this through a pro forma, this makes sense.
So 99 units, that's a very peculiar number. Why 99? Why not 101? Or we could have taken a few 2 bedrooms and turned them into single bedrooms or maybe studios and made it, a few units more. Some people think that building more units will mean more money at the end, right? But that's not the case. But 99 units, why did we go to 99 units? Want to explain that?
In our market, there happens to be an ordinance that says that if you have 100 units or more, you have to have a 24/7 security guard, licensed security guard. And in order to, it says by default you have to have one, and that if you don't want to have one, you have to apply for an exemption. So it's in the hands of the city to determine whether or not they want to grant the exemption. We do see that the city does grant them. So it's not like you can't get it, but by default, you're kind of taking a risk, right? So if something happens in your building, your building's done, you've built this thing, 5 years down the line, something happens. You're managing the building beautifully, but something happens, there's a theft, somebody complains to their council person, the landlord's doing a bad job managing this building. City comes in and says, oh, you know what, I'm taking away your exemption. you got to get a security guard. So there was a risk to having more density in this building. The size of this site and the size of the building was such that it wasn't like the size of this land was so big that the overall rentable square footage we end up having in this building was trending towards, let's say, 150 unit building, and we're trying to figure out a way we need to get this under 100. It wasn't like that. Right here, we had the size of this building was going to range the amount of gross square footage and net square footage that we had in this building was going to end up with a unit count that was going to probably be somewhere in the upper 90s, that maybe if you want to densify it more, perhaps you get to like 115, heavy studios, let's say, or 110. It wasn't that far off. So for us, it just made sense, like, let's do a little bit more 2 bedrooms. We're seeing in the market that we might have a situation where we'll be able to attract tenants that are a little bit stickier. They'll stay in the building because it's a larger unit. They'll keep renewing. And so, there it may be more market demand 2-3 years down the line when the building is finished for a 2 bedroom. So both from a market perspective and as well as like the physical size of the building and that ordinance, it just made sense to target, let's say, 99 units. The other thing to point out at is, we've seen this before, that when you start to densify your building, you have more studios, let's say, or more one bedrooms. that means you have more kitchens, you have more bathrooms. So you tend to see hard cost per square foot go higher, drift higher, because you have those more expensive spaces, those finished spaces. So when you tend to densify your building, your hard cost per square foot tends to go up. It goes in that direction. As for amount, percentage, it can vary, right? But it tends to go up. But part of the reason why you might do it is because studios, perhaps, rent per square foot tends to be higher. Your one bedroom rent per square foot tends to be higher. So market forces might dictate that you do that. And so you may have a more valuable building in the end. But there's pros and cons to doing it. So it's a combination of a bunch of different factors, right? The market analysis and everything.
With that point you just made, why not eliminate a few studios, for example? Take the studios that are about 500 square feet, and you create a few 3-bedrooms instead, so that you have more bedrooms but less kitchens, and it'll cost you less to build. This is just a question for us right now. It's like I'm thinking about it like while we're doing this, right?
It's a good question.
I wonder if that helps in any way, because now you have perhaps you could have 3 roommates living together sharing a kitchen. And for us, it costs less because we only have to build 1 kitchen. But now 3 people can share that apartment.
Yeah, so right? I feel like that kind of is dictated by what the market analysis is telling you. So in this market, 3 bedrooms tend to attract certain type of tenants. So you get that example of roommates, which is definitely a very common occurrence where this property is located for 3 bedrooms. And then you also get, let's say, families. Families perhaps tend to have kids. Then you need to think about school districts and things like that, right? So when you look at the data in this area, the 3 bedrooms, rent per square foot, the differential in rent per square foot is pretty high. Not only is it high, there's also vacancy issues. So let's say when you do have that, let's say you lease it up, the initial lease up might take you longer, or it does tend to take you longer. Or when you have a renewal, it could take you longer as well. And roommates are tricky, right? Because the thing about roommates is it happens in 2 bedrooms as well, but less frequently so. Let's say 2 roommates living in a 2-bedroom or 3 roommates living in a 3-bedroom. One person needs to move out. They contact the property manager. Oh, hey, we have 2 people want to stay here. 1 person wants to leave. It tends to be a little bit of a operational issue. Okay, how do you handle the security deposit? What do you do? How do you vet the new person? Because in the end, from the landlord's perspective, the lease is in the name of all 3 people. All 3 people are on the hook. What happens if 1 roommate stops paying and there's a infighting going on? So there's these operational things to think about.
And it probably takes a lot of time for, let's say, for a 3-bedroom, for 1 person to take a 3-bedroom and then go find 2 roommates.
Yeah,
to fill that up.
That right? Too. Yeah, and then they got to market. How does a landlord sit in all of this? The landlord doesn't want to be the one matchmaking and pairing,
right?
At all. It's in the hands of the roommate. Landlord just says, okay, I have 3 applicants. Might be best friends. It may just be complete strangers to each other. But there's 3 applicants, and they all have to be vetted because they're all on the hook for the lease. So it's a different dynamic. And obviously that dynamic affects what's happening and what you observe in the market. How long do these 3 bedrooms stay vacant? What is the rent on them? So it's just different. So here it didn't make sense to build it because of those factors, the type of target tenant and the what we see in the data and what the market analysis is telling us about those 3 bedrooms.
So this building is very efficient. Obviously, we're down at 17% loss factor. We typically try to factor in about 20% sometimes, but we aim for 20%. If you get to 25, it's still pretty decent. Now, part of this development, we had another building which wasn't as efficient. Show us that one.
So yeah, this is another building where the land is only about 6,400, 6,500 square feet. There's a front yard here, front yard here. This is the rear yard property line. This is a rear or side. In this case, it tends to be defined as a side yard. So that's the lot line. And because of how small the lot is, we basically had to do almost full lot coverage. There's very little setback here. There's very little setback here. We did it because there's some windows over here, but the rest of the building is on the lot line almost everywhere. And this isn't ideal, right? Because when you have let's say a one bedroom here with a window, it's basically facing a brick wall over here.
Sure. Now, on this ground floor, you could already see that the common area and the utilities, all those rooms are taking about 50% of that whole ground floor, maybe more.
That's right. It's almost half.
50%.
6,600 square foot lot. The gross square footage of each floor is 6,300 square feet. So let's call it the floor plate. That kind of, it's almost, the land's 95% covered. So that's your lot coverage or building coverage. On the first floor, half of the gross square footage had to go towards common areas. And we were a little conservative, but maybe when you actually get into the process of doing construction drawings and retaining an architect, you start to see perhaps you can optimize it, but you have to work really hard. You have to work really hard to make sense here. And since this building is a 5-story building, the building codes dictate you need almost the same stuff in this building as a 6-story building. Same 2 means of egress. Here it's just 1 elevator versus 2 in the other building. You obviously need a lobby. You need a sprinkler room. You need, most likely we'll need a transformer room. Maybe not. That's going to be something that comes up later when you get into electrical design. But still, you're going to need a lot of these like trash rooms, areas that are not as valuable, but you're going to have to incorporate them in your building. The upper floor is also relatively efficient, and maybe this gets optimized better later, but you can start to see this hallway relative to your units, the rentable square footage. You have a trash room, 2 means of egress. They all eat into your gross square footage, and then you end up with a loss factor around 14% on those upper floors. So if you look at the larger site, that loss factor was a little bit lower on the upper floors as well.
It was 13.
Overall, when you start to look at it, this loss factor is higher as expected. When we ran pro forma on this, when I start to see this, I can tell that this building, the efficiency is going to chip away at what's possible, the profit margin in the building. And even though it might be like 4 or 5 points higher compared to the larger site, that's a material difference because this is the entire building. And then once you start to factor in everything else, the fact that smaller buildings tend to cost more per square foot, all these other things, a building that has such a high lot coverage, you have windows facing neighbors, brick walls. It's not a great setup. So it's not a good optimal setup for the building. And I can kind of tell that this building is going to, once we run it through an actual financial pro forma, we're going to notice that this building is worse than the other one. It's just not going to be as profitable.
You can't really tell until you run that financial pro forma.
Yeah. And
that's when you get the truth.
Yeah. And you start to see it. My gut's telling me just from looking at it that that's what's going to end up happening. One other quick thing to look at that we also do, right, is 3-dimensional massing. The reason why we do this is, when we do development in dense areas, the city wants to understand that if you're going to be, here we're proposing a multifamily building in a residential area. So the city is going to ask, this area is predominantly smaller buildings. How is a building that's going to be multifamily and much larger going to fit into the neighborhood? What does it look like physically? Without getting into facades and designs, right? Those are things that also come up. But here we like to understand just what does it feel like? So we did a 3D massing that looked at a 6-story building relative to the neighboring structures. How does it feel? What does it look like? And when we looked at it, it was pretty reasonable because we had some buildings, maybe not on the same street, but a block over is a taller building over here that seems to fit in to the building that we're proposing. Although the neighboring building is obviously smaller, it doesn't feel out of place. This is a corner lot. Corner lots are good because there's a lot of light and air around the building. It's not wedged up against mid-block against two smaller buildings. And seeing it visually like this and helps, people that sit in planning and zoning more comfortable with what we're proposing, showing them visually what this looks like.
I went to a meeting once and somebody was looking at a building, not like this, but a very tall building. And they were looking at this aerial view of the whole neighborhood and how the building fit into the neighborhood. And one of the people in the community said, I'm not a bird, I'm not a plane, I'm not a helicopter. So when I'm walking around the neighborhood, this is not how I see it. Show me a rendering of how I'm going to see it when I'm walking my dog, right? That was a really good point, but the developer did get around to it to create a better rendering. and then they were able to show like what it feels like when you're walking in the neighborhood, what that building feels like relative to the other buildings. It actually looked better when you looked at it in that perspective than when you looked at it from above like this.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it's definitely something that we tend to do. In the feasibility phase, we don't do it, but that's extremely important when you're going for approvals. Because at the end of the day, we're not birds.
Right,
we don't
exactly.
fly.
This is not how we see it, right?
Yeah, all of our projects, right? We do renderings. We start to get into like, okay, what is a building facade going to look like? What does the materials look like? How does this harmonize with the neighboring building and all of the buildings around it? At this very preliminary phase, we like to see this because when we're running these pro formas at a feasibility phase, the setbacks, your building envelope, that buildable square footage and those loss factors and the unit types and the mix and everything that goes into the pro forma are very material to determining whether or not a development is feasible financially. Whether this has a brick facade or not doesn't have as material of an impact on the pro forma, but the building envelope and the size, structure, density, height, those are very material. Loss factors, things they're very material to the pro forma, and understanding what is the land worth, can we make this project feasible, can we make money on it. So those are, at a preliminary feasibility phase, the things that we tend to focus on and look at. And I think when you were looking at this building, right, you had some good ideas of, hey, it's a 6-story building. Like, if somebody said, hey, this is 6 stories, is too big, or hey, I feel like it doesn't fit in, right? I think you propose that you could do some things with the facade to make it feel a little better. Like the first floors, like this building next door, so let's say it's about 4 to 3.5 stories. Height-wise, almost like a 4-story building. You could do a facade that kind of harmonizes well with this building, and then you suggested take the 2 upper floors, do something different to help give it a different feel relative to the rest of the look. A different
color, a different maybe glass that's a different color. Make it a bit lighter so that it kind of like blends in with the sky, right? And then when you're creating that streetscape, or from the street point of view, when you're walking your dog and you're looking at the building, it doesn't look as overwhelming. If you have a completely brick building all the way to the top, 6 stories.
Yeah, the monotony can make it feel overwhelming.
Right.
So there are things you can play around with to deal with those type of issues that come up and trying to determine if you can get something like this approved in a neighborhood like this. We also did the one for the smaller site, and as we discussed, this one is a very high lot covered building. It's basically taking up the entire lot, but it's something we had to do because we needed more buildable or rentable square footage to make numbers work. And even then, it was still a challenge, in our opinion.
We ran the performance on both of these things, and we determined that obviously the larger one was very efficient and very profitable, but we decided to scrap the smaller project because of all the waste that was in the building relative to the size of it.
Yeah, there wasn't enough value creation in the process. to pursue this one. Maybe certain things change, right? Market factors obviously affect pro forma, cap rates, the value of the building at the end, rents, things like that. But based on today's numbers, it didn't make sense to do this project. There just wasn't enough.
It didn't make sense for us, but because of where we are in in our development with what we're building today and what we're sized for in our firm. But for someone else, that project could make sense.
Good, yeah.
Depends on where they are, right? So if you're a developer and you're going from 1 to 2 family houses and you're looking to get to 99 unit buildings or 200 unit buildings, that may be a good project to take that leap to get to that size project at some point, because you got to build your track record.
Yeah, it's a smaller. I think the total rentable the total gross square footage here was like 30,000. This one was more than double. I forget the exact number, but it was a lot larger. Yeah, this one was the smaller one was 31,000 buildable square feet. Bigger one was almost 100,000, so 3 times bigger. So there are different things that come into play when you start to do the bigger buildings. Obviously, financing, equity needs, cash needs, all that stuff. So the larger project, this size project is something that is in our wheelhouse. And when we ran the pro forma on it, it was something that made sense. Like you said in the beginning, right? So that this first step, like when you came to me with this and we wanted to run numbers on this, like before I could even do any kind of number crunching, the first thing we had to do was start to lay it out. I think back in the day we used to do this on like pieces of paper. I remember your sketches.
Napkin sketches.
Yeah, do your graphic design skills and apply it to coming up with a building envelope.
Back in the early 2000s when I started doing this work, the architect would literally do it like on a piece of paper in front of us. He'll just start sketching it out. We'd have a conversation and we would develop it that way. But today with the technology, you can do all this pretty quickly.
Yeah,
on a program.
You can like it shows here, do a 3-dimensional drawing and drop it on a satellite image and start to get a real feel for it. So
yeah,
all of this is, I feel like, important steps that you have to take before you do anything.
Yep. And we're lucky enough to have a draftsperson in-house that can create these images.
Yeah, he's got an architectural background, so.
Right. And then we could just take all those numbers and quickly create a pro forma.
When we looked at this lot initially, this 20,000 square foot lot, we see that it's in an area that is zoned 1 and 2 family residential. But here we are proposing a multifamily project, which is different than the zoning. That means we're asking for variances, which may or may not be granted. Before part of that analysis is figuring out, okay, well, what are all of our options, right? When we're talking to this person who owns a property, we could run numbers on single family too. You could run 1 family, 2 family numbers. We could do something. It's not something that we have a type of project that we would be as interested in, but that's one end of the spectrum, right? But since this is a corner lot, it's contiguous, it's 20,000 square feet, it's got public transit access, it has these different features that make sense to do multifamily. We ended up running numbers and doing a design around a multifamily proposal. But we have to ask ourselves, okay, is this realistic? Is this feasible? Because not every city is going to be willing to grant you variances like that. Every city is different. It's like something specific to a market and a zoning department or planning department and the relationship that a developer has, existing relationship that the developer might have with the city, what the needs are of the city, right? Because we know that part of the city's job is to think about the needs of the constituents that live there. So here, this is an urban setting. There's a need for housing in general, like the rest of the country. So that's a problem everywhere. There's also a need for affordable housing, not just market rate housing. And so this project when we were thinking about what we could do here, multifamily made sense, not just because like in terms of schematics, the physical layout, it makes sense to do a building like this, but we felt comfortable that the city, which wants housing, would consider approving something like this if we deliver something good to them. And here, in addition to building a nice building, we're going to propose putting affordable housing in here, right? So we're trying to kind of like tick the box to convince the city that this is something that makes sense to do, because the zoning is different than what we're proposing here.
And we're not the only ones doing it. If you look in the entire area, there are other projects of this size. People have taken 1-family, 2-family residential areas and turned them into multifamily. So we feel pretty safe going into this area and going into the city and asking them for multifamily.
Yeah, have a conversation with them, right? Like, I don't think we necessarily go in and just dictate terms.
Right.
We, as much as we ask them to listen to what we're proposing, we would listen to them and see what they're thinking about as well and the needs of the city. So
yeah,
it ends up being a conversation. So we felt comfortable when we this initial step of a feasibility, proposing something like this. But we know this building may end up changing in the end in different ways. And like we always do, we'll look at what those changes end up being, how do they impact the analysis, and does it remain feasible, and having that conversation with the city and everyone involved.
And this is what you need to have that conversation. You don't have to have these like fully detailed plans yet. When you're having an initial conversation, you can just come in with a schematic design, an initial pro forma, show them the numbers and have that discussion. As you just saw, the schematic design is all about turning data into form and vision. You're figuring out what the building should look like, how it fits on the lot, and how it serves the people who live and work there. In the next video, we'll move into the financial modeling and show you how we take the schematic design and plug it into the pro forma to see if the numbers actually work. So if you're serious about real estate development, click right here to keep watching. And don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the rest of the series. I'll see you in the next one.